You're listening to Rustbelt Radio, the Pittsburgh Independent Media Center's weekly review of news from the grassroots.
Dr. Naftali Kaminski is a physician and research scientist at UPMC who moved to Pittsburgh in 2002 from Israel. He grew up in Israel, served his required term in the Israeli military, as well as attended medical school and received training in Israeli hospitals. He maintains strong connections to Israel through family ties and friends who are still living there. Dr. Kaminski was instrumental in organizing the recent pro-Israel, pro-peace event on January 15th at the Jewish Community Center in Squirrel Hill. During an interview with Rustbelt Radio, he explains what being pro-Israel, pro-peace means to him.
Actually, I don't understand how you can be pro-Israel and pro-war. And I think there's something has happened which I find very disturbing. Many Jewish voices in the community, and it was a little bit similar also in the previous Lebanon war, it wasn't only that they said, we support Israel in its war. They said we support the war. And I really think that, any human being should have a very simple point of view, which is, even if I have to fight, war is bad and I want it to end. So I think that it is almost like an aberration in the way people consider this war. Now the other thing for me, and it may be different from people who grew up here, this whole question of pro-Israel is a little bit ridiculous. Israel is, this is one of my countries, and Israel is my main country. And my mother lives there, and it's, I like Hebrew, I like the culture, so I don't need to prove to anybody that I'm pro-Israel, and it's not like I think that I need to, but I did serve in the military, and I did pay my taxes for many years. So, I think that this whole notion is a little bit, it's one of the ways that in democratic society, mostly the right wing tries to dominate the discussion. It's not dissimilar from, if you're against the war in Iraq, are you against the soldiers, right? The same way that they tried to, the whole circus with Obama wearing the flag pin or not wearing the flag pin, right? So I think this is a way that what happens is that in most democratic societies, not only the US or Israel, right wing has found ways that they could dominate the discussion. And one way is basically they challenge your loyalty the moment you criticize something.
Next, Dr. Kaminski shares his experiences in the Israeli military.
Well, things were different then. Yeah. And there's two big differences. One is the oppression of population in occupied territories was much lower. There wasn't an ongoing constant conflict, although it wasn't necessarily a true perception, but the perception that the military sort of at least tries to act in a sort of an ethical way was stronger. So, you just went and did your duty and you always, it's funny because we were trained and you had the feeling that if you would encounter something that you thought was unacceptable, you would basically say it. There is this thing that you get trained which is called the black flag of illegality, and you learn it during your training. So many of us, especially in the 80s, I don't know how it is now because I haven't been trained now, this was part of your essential training, like safety. The way you learn to be safe about a gun, you also learn in a sense, and we know that there's nothing like ethical use of guns, but at least you learned, this is what you do, this is what you ask before you do, and this is stuff you never do. Now I'll give you an example. For instance, in my training, we were trained that your life is not worth than the life of a civilian. So you have to do everything you can to prevent the life of civilians, basically. It doesn't say necessarily that Israel always did this. War is war, but it's almost like for us, some of the things they did now completely don't make sense just because of this issue that they actually killed civilians in order to avoid military casualties.
Because every 18-year-old Israeli youth is required to join the army, its influence is extremely significant in Israeli society. Rustbelt Radio inquired about the societal pressures that surround serving in the Israeli army.
When I grew up, you may say that things were a little bit more clear and more streamlined, and society did what it did, so you didn't even think that there was another option. Right. I think now, because society is more diverse, there's a lot of... So, for instance, my daughter went last year and spent a year with an Israeli group that does social volunteer work, and they live in communes in disadvantaged cities, and and they had very serious discussions. And actually, one day this summer, I was in my mother's house, and her friends came, and I was just sitting and listening, and they basically had this discussion. So, can you go to the army and still maintain your views about justice? And I think the majority of kids in her group, 18-year-olds, chose to go to the army.
Why?
One is the feeling is that if you are an Israeli and you're going to live there, that's part of the Israeli experience.
Okay.
There is this almost illusion that if the good guys don't go, then the army is going to be much worse. Everybody served in the army. You grew up on heroic stories and war stories, even if you're sort of part of the peace camp. And I'm not sure what I would... I would probably encourage my kids not to go to the army if we were there now. But I'm not completely sure.
After the pro-Israel, pro-peace gathering, Dr. Kaminski observed some of the reactions among the local Jewish community. He explains his initial understanding of the Jewish community in Pittsburgh and how that has evolved.
When I came to Pittsburgh, people told me, the Jewish community is relatively right-wing. And they're not open to different views or to sort of the views of secular and what we call sane Israel. What I discovered that it was completely untrue, because the majority of the Jewish community is, American Jewish liberal. Still 80% voted Democrat this election, right? Many people hold very strong convictions about human rights, about pro-choice, about the rights of minorities. And although traditionally this stops the moment you start speaking about Israel and Palestine, many people actually, when you sort of challenge them, or when they find the fact that some of their doubts and concerns about Israel are validated, they're not glad, they're saddened, but they find it more comfortable. So I think that the Jewish community in Pittsburgh is willing to engage in a real serious dialogue how you really help Israel to get out of this mess. For instance, the Jewish school, the day school, Community Day, brought in a Palestinian student from CMU, Palestinian American, and an Israeli guy to speak about their shared experiences. And they did a very good job. Another parent, and I was a little bit involved in this, showed a documentary again to the 8th grader about... This documentary is called To Die in Jerusalem. It's about the mother of a girl who died in a suicide bombing, trying to meet the mother of the girl who committed the suicide bombing. But the film basically allows you to sort of have a glimpse of both worlds. So we had a very good discussion with 8th graders in Community Day. So there were a few people that wanted to express concern about what was happening in Gaza. And some contacted me, and I said, well, what we should do is basically have people speaking from Israel and from Gaza.
During the pro-Israel, pro-peace gathering, Dr. Kaminski spoke via conference call to Dr. Ezeldin Abuleish, a Palestinian doctor and personal friend who lost 3 daughters in the recent crisis in Gaza. Dr. Kaminski explains how he met Dr. Abuleish and some shared visions they had about an Israeli-Palestinian hospital.
I was in San Francisco. He came to give a talk at some health conference, women's health conference. And somehow somebody gave him my phone number, and we sort of became friends. He gave a very interesting, very depressing talk